All right, we're going to start up. Just before we start, the views of the speakers do not represent the Federalist Society nor Georgetown University. All right, we're going to have a great conversation tonight. Here we have Timothy Carney. He is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on economic competition, cronyism, civil society, localism, and religion in America. Excuse me. He's concurrently the senior columnist at the Washington Examiner, and his work has been featured in numerous publications such as The Atlantic, New York Post, New York Times, Reason Magazine, The Wall Street Journal. Mr. Carney has also made television appearances on CNN, CNBC, Fox News, MSNBC, and the PBS NewsHour. Luke Sheahan is an assistant professor of political science at Duquesne University and a non-resident scholar at the Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society at the University of Pennsylvania. He teaches courses in public law and American politics. Sheahan's research focuses on First Amendment rights with special focus on freedom of association. In addition to his work on freedom of association, Sheahan has also published on academic freedom and various figures in the 20th century of political and social thought, especially the American sociologist Robert Nisbet. He's lectured extensively on religious liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of association at many colleges and universities across the country. Now, tonight we're going to be talking about the effects of the pandemic on civil society and families. Just to start us off, there have been more severe pandemics in human history. However, our pampered lifestyle makes us think otherwise. We seem to have recovered quite a bit. I guess the biggest recent one was the Spanish flu about 100 years ago, but that didn't seem to affect us much in the modern day. How do you see the coronavirus permanently reshaping society and our lifestyles, to either panelist?
Thank you. We don't know. The world was quite different 100 years ago when the Spanish flu hit. There were permanent effects, some of which we can still see. One interesting one, I didn't know. I grew up in New York City with very hot radiators. And what I recently learned is that this was invented as so that people could have their windows open. The radiators are by the window. They overheat your apartment unless you crack it. So if you have friends who live in New York or in an old dorm, they might say, my radiator is so hot, I need to keep my window open. So obviously that's a very minor, not a big thing, but I think that for a generation, we'll have people bearing the scars of the lockdowns, the pandemic, the fear that came with it. I think that religion and religious worship and gathering will be changed forever or for a generation. A lot of things that were going to happen, whether we're talking about churches meeting over Zoom or outside of the religious scope, technological acceleration of people working from home, things that probably would have happening a full 20 years ahead of time. And then that will have a ripple effect. So us moving into an even more virtual, not in real life way of interacting, I think will stick around for a long time. And I don't think that's a good thing, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you can usually think of human beings as having kind of three families. There's your first family, which is your siblings and your parents or your children. And your second family is your neighbors, aunts and uncles, and things like that, people like that. And then your third family are the organizations you're involved with, your churches, your schools. The lockdowns have basically wiped out our interactions with the latter two, and we're kind of reduced to our immediate family in terms of face-to-face interaction. And that's been true for, going on a year now. And so we're habituated to not spending time with those people, not going to those places and that sort of thing. And so all those relationships have dissolved, and it's, as the pandemic lifts, I even think of, my Friday and Saturday nights, I'm pretty habituated to a Netflix binging. It's not going to be easy to just switch gears back to a healthier social lifestyle. And I think a lot of people won't for a long time. They're habituated to this sort of way of living. And those relationships, we know are really important in those second and third families. And they've just been wiped out. So yeah, the ramifications will be pretty serious, I think.
Well, I'll just pile on the habits there. I mean, to some extent, we will get some people like rushing back. I know I'm gonna, when I'm kind of allowed to, hug people more when I'm vaccinated and my friends are vaccinated. I'm gonna be a lot more huggy than I used to. So there will be some of that. But for instance, so I'm a Catholic, and for us, virtual attendance was never an option. I mean, there were elderly homebound for which that was a thing, but the idea that you can go by watching YouTube or a live stream was something that never would have occurred to us before this. Catholics in the US are operating under, our word for it, because Catholics have a big word for everything, is a dispensation. For the first time in our life, except for major blizzards, we're not actually required to attend Mass on Sundays. It's very easy to get used to that dispensation. It's very easy to decide to slip into I don't need to go through the motions of this going to Mass anymore. Get disconnected from your community, get a new Sunday habit. Maybe it's even a good Sunday habit, going for a walk with the family or something like that, and for that to replace it. So while church attendance now, we can say, oh, it's way down because of the pandemic, because of attendance limits, because people are worried about this. I think it's never going to rebound in-person church attendance, even in the Catholic Church, when the bishops lift the dispensation. It's never going to rebound to where it was beforehand.
And on that note of getting used to difficult situations, where do you think mask wearing will go? I know it's very common in East Asia to wear masks when you're sick. That's something very new and strange to the Western world. Do you think that habit will continue? Do you think it'll die out? Do you think people will embrace being able to see each other again, or keep masked up?
Well, interesting thing, long-term effects. My youngest, who's only been in school this year, so never had school before, never has had maskless school. She is much more expressive with her eyes than other kids. And I think this is true. I think we're going to find younger kids find more ways to communicate up here that don't involve as much of the signals there, and hopefully be better at reading it. But there's still no doubt it's much harder to communicate. And if you live in a city, you saw Asian Americans wearing masks on the metro before this last year. And it was always it was always off-putting, because you'd be like, what are you wearing a mask? Are you afraid of me? I didn't know it was probably somebody who had a cold and didn't want to spread it on the metro. But still, I find it creates a real difference. It's harder to talk, it's harder to understand, and it's harder to read facial cues. I bet you'll see some people wearing it every time they're in a crowded indoor space, or at least when they're on the subway and the bus. And we might actually just say, you got a little cough and you're not going to stay home because it's not a full-fledged cold, maybe wear a mask.
Yeah, I think something like that'll happen. I do think with the habituation to Zoom, I think a big thing will be I'm teaching classes hybrid, so I've got some students in class, some piping into the classroom via Zoom, and I think it'll be pretty normal for them to get an email from professors and say, hey, I'm a little down today. It's all on Zoom. And that'll be the kind of the thing we do. So I don't know about mask wearing, but I think working from home will be a lot more, it'll be thought of as quite rude to come to the office with a cold when you could have just Zoomed in.
Yeah, but those couple things, the professor has a cold, student has a cold, employee has a cold, and they stay home for that. That's all a positive development in my mind.
Yes.
But none of us are going to show up to work, or I'm only going to attend this class on Zoom, or I'm only going to teach this class on Zoom. Those are seriously negative things. Yes. Now, there are upsides to somebody who wants to, dad in Grand Rapids is sick and I'm going to go spend a few months with him, maybe his last month, and I'm still going to be able to work great. But in general, if we're not in a workplace with our colleagues, if we're not in a classroom with our fellow students or with our professors, there's a serious loss. And this is something I bet younger kids I think a lot of people didn't really realize before this last year. We sort of imagined that the virtual everything was going to be just as good. Well, you've got text, you've got Zoom, I can see your face, et cetera. But without the sort of serendipitous, unplanned encounters that we get from these things, so much learning is lost. And this is probably the last group of people I need to explain this to. If you're currently a law student and you experience college, or if this is your second year and you experience a full semester of in-person, you just realize how much informal learning we do. And it's a sort of intellectual humility to realize this. So the best professor in the world can't plan out ahead of time how he's going to instruct things. He's going to play off of what the students are saying. The best student in the world, it's going to be more likely what he asks after class. It might be more likely what he or she asks after class. So it leads to the best thing he learns. And the friendships obviously are a huge part of learning.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, in my experience teaching classes, teaching before and after, word for word, I'm teaching some of the same stuff, and it's a lot harder to get through. There's a lot of students that are that need more help, and I know they're hearing the exact same thing in class as as the previous semesters, or explaining writing assignments, for example. The directions were crystal clear, and I'm giving them the same handout. And for some reason, this semester there's way more confusion over it, and there's just that loss of face-to-face interaction is really massive in terms of what they're really missing out on. I mean, even I have fewer students come to office hours, and of course they can just Zoom in. They're very easy to do so. It's way easier actually than going to the fifth floor of College Hall at Duquesne University, and yet fewer students come by. So it's really a big loss. I don't really know where this is going, but it can't be like this forever because we're missing out on a lot of that human interaction. A lot of that learning takes place in that 20 minutes in office hours and the 5 minutes after class, those sorts of things.
And with that theme of technology, and I know we've been focusing a lot on the student world, but the work world as well. How do you think people's professional lives will go moving forward? When it comes to real estate, New York is a very different place than it is now. Offices are moving entirely online. If you guys want to speak anything on that.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Some of my the restaurants and bars downtown where we used to go here in DC have all shut down because their clientele was disproportionately was overwhelmingly office people. So I would not want to be somebody who owned a large portfolio of urban commercial real estate. Again, I think people really benefit from being physically proximate to their coworkers, just because sometimes the questions that we need to ask don't occur to us ahead of time until we're in a maybe somewhat wandering, somewhat rambling conversation that just isn't as likely to happen digitally. And that said, there's a lot of people, my job involves reporting that often I'm doing from the road, from Western PA, from Utah or whatever. And it's great to be able to do that remotely. And some people, again, you might want to live in Idaho and be an editor and so there will be benefits from it, but those benefits are kind of easy to see. And what's harder to see is the value of community built by in-person contact. This is what I argued in my book, and that when we are physically thrust in, one of the things about it is that you don't get to choose the people around you as well when you're in a physical community. Like, who else was randomly assigned to be in your section of that class, or who else signed up for the same class? When we're just on text groups, those are text groups that we probably joined. I don't even know if text is an archaic technology for our young people today, but WhatsApp groups or Zoom calls that you go ahead and plan, you get to pick your own environment. There's a learning that is lost to when you do that. It's another thing about church for me. I go to a very diverse Catholic church, and we learn so much from that. While if we were just hanging out with sort of our picked and chosen friends, they might be more similar, more likely to have big families or be conservative or Irish or from New York or whatever our traits are that we select for. And instead, every Sunday, we're in this sort of United Nations of people of all sorts of ideology, background, immigration status, age, etc. That is great for us. So that loss in the workplace of the in-person contact is very likely to be underestimated ahead of time and not really noticed until much later.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In the habituation that's taken place towards technology, it's going to be hard to go back. I mean, one thing that does make our time a little different from Spanish flu is, whatever social distancing or whatever happened, they didn't have Netflix and Zoom to replace all these relationships, and we do. So, we think we're having the same conversations. We fooled ourselves into thinking it, the same work relationships and all that, and we aren't. It's kind of sad. It's a very different dynamic, and we know this from psychological studies. We know that talking to someone through a screen is psychologically taxing because you can't make out their facial expressions as well. So you think somebody's scowling at you and they're not. You're trying to read them and you can't. And your brain, where's your brain out emotionally? And I worry about kids who aren't getting worn out by that, but that's how they aren't learning the facial social cues that they otherwise would at that age, in first grade and that sort of thing. So with masks on and even talking to people via screens, they're not getting the socialization that they need. And some of that can get made up next year and the year after that, perhaps, but it's possible we're going to miss out, that age group will miss out on that development, and it'll stick with them all the way up.
And I just also think of like workplace mentorship is almost all sort of informal. I mean, when I was the commentary editor for 3 years, and there were lots of things I would never put in an email just because it wasn't sort of technically my job. I would email, hey, our deadline for this is noon on Friday. But I'd say to somebody, hey, by the way, you've been here a year. You're eligible for the 401k. You should sign up. What? I didn't read the employment. Oh, you get a 3% match. Boom. That's like good advice that can make a huge difference in somebody's life 40 years from now. All of you, when you get the opportunity to get a 401k, you should put money in it. But that's the sort of thing that I don't think anybody's told the people now who might have started a year ago and have been in the office. And so one of the things I thought about when the New York Times had its blow up, Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed saying, send the troops to the streets to shut down these riots. The New York Times staff had this rebellion about this op-ed and they ended up driving out the op-ed editor. It was a crazy, I think, sort of shameful scene. There was some article written about it praising this little rebellion, saying this was only possible because everybody was working remotely and they didn't have the tyranny of a boss sort of sitting over their shoulder, questioning their actions, forming, guiding their opinions for them. And I was thinking, maybe the tyranny of colleagues and bosses is mentorship and friendship. And maybe losing that drives them towards more of a fundamentalism. And as workplaces become more tendentious, that I'm seeing in my industry, the media, I think the lack of being in person, the lack of friendship and mentorship is a huge part of the problem.
Yeah, I think it's actually a lot harder to hate somebody you talk to in person. It's easy to caricature people when they're distant. And so, not working with people, I mean, would you really try to drive out your colleague if you were down the hall from them? Had coffee with them every morning? that's a little tougher. But if you just read their emails, they get under your skin, you see their tweets, and that gets under your skin, it's easier to caricature them and hate them and start lobbying for them to lose their job, but not when you know them. And that's a big thing. Yeah.
Yeah. If any of you are, a conservative at Georgetown, you probably have a friend who says, look, you're different from other conservatives. You're actually like nice and thoughtful and not a jerk. And you kind of want to take it as a compliment, but you kind of want to say, hey, not every other conservative is a jerk. I'm just the one okay? I'm just the one who like would buy a beer for you. But that attitude of not all conservatives are jerks, there's a lot of people at every newspaper and a lot of college faculties now who haven't had that thought for the last year because they haven't been socializing. They haven't had to sit next to a conservative or whatever at the bar.
With that in mind, how do you think that the pandemic has encouraged political radicalism, whether it's due to humanization or dehumanization, or just overall lack of knowledge or differing opinions, isolation in the media?
I think all sorts of things. I mean, I was at the White House in June when the protests were going on, and there were legitimate causes behind the Black Lives Matter protests, but the energy and the size of them was partly, this is, I think, the most basic effect, a lack of things to do. There was one woman who screamed, "You think we're going away?" She was screaming this at the White House. We're not. We're going to be here tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. We're in the middle of an effing pandemic. We don't have anywhere else to be. So that's sort of the most basic level. On a deeper level, and I wrote an article after January 6th, the riots at the Capitol. I talked to these people, as many as I could, not the people who stormed into the Capitol, but who marched there and maybe banged on the windows and that sort of thing. And what I got from a lot of them was a sense of isolation. And what does isolation do? A couple things. One, if you hear a phrase of somebody talking about whatever, law, politics, the virus, the vaccine, and somebody says, well, I do my own research, that is not a sign that this is a person who is well informed. That is a sign of somebody who is very likely they went down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, YouTube videos, that sort of thing. If I encourage you, just think of some random subject and start to do your own research where you just follow every link or watch YouTube videos and watch the next recommended YouTube videos. You're going to end up in a dark place. But also, I think the biggest effect is a sort of fundamentalism, that there are principles, general rules that we hold dear to. And then we're always kind of softening them, making exceptions, refining, narrowing their application through a real life, messy interactions with people we don't know. What being alone, only connecting with people you choose to, does is it keeps those hard edges on your principles, you could call them, but it makes it easier to be a fundamentalist, like the young reporters and staffers at the New York Times, and like the people who just became 100% convinced that the election was stolen and were willing to basically ruin their lives for it. So that's the main thing. I think we get talked away from a fundamentalism the more that we sort of have to bump into other people.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there was a good article. I think it was, I think the Manhattan Institute had an article, and then the Nation had an article, and they were kind of from left and right, critiquing their own side. And sort of the article in the Nation was saying we've spent 4 years insisting we didn't actually lose that election, and not living in the real world. So we ran down all these rabbit holes. And this has not been good for us. And the Manhattan Institute is kind of similar. I think that's where it was on the saying, we have a large section of the right that doesn't live in reality. And I think I read the articles on the same day. It was, but it was a broader problem even prior to the pandemic of wanting to live in a virtual world, because we have been living more virtually than we had before. And then we're thrust into an entire year, and you're just not living in reality. some of the descriptions of the January 6th protesters, were going out for drinks afterwards to have cocktails, and I think somebody described them as live action role playing. Like they played this, they look at us, we stormed the Capitol, and then we're going to go have drinks like they're actors or something, and they're done with their game. I mean, it was a bizarre, kind of surreal thing, but they've been like me, only around a handful of other people for 11 months. I can see where your grasp on reality just kind of starts to fall away, and so it's a major problem. So I think it's definitely contributed. It's exacerbated that problem. We already had a problem with polarization. We already had a problem with kind of conspiracy theories on both sides getting out of hand. And 11 months sitting alone with your computer did not help.
Well, and this was the argument that I made in Alienated America was before this lockdown, was that alienation and isolation have driven extremism. So far short of people who would storm a Capitol or anything like that, just, the Bernie Sanders movement wasn't mostly a, Medicare for all movement. It was people who were saying, I'm totally disenfranchised and I want somebody to do something about it. And Bernie was going to take on the bankers to do it. I think the Trump movement was an expression in 2016, was an expression of alienation, of people who said, I don't really have control over anything. And that feeling was a result of a lack of a connection to a human community. I already feel like I have control over stuff, not because my columns change people's mind. They don't. Like there was one guy once who wrote me an email, said, you changed my mind by your column. That's one human being in 20 years of doing this. But because I run a T-ball program at my Catholic parish, and I was able to convince the pastor to convince somebody else for a discounted amount to turn our baseball field back to our baseball field. Like I changed my neighborhood. It looks different in the Google satellite image because of this. But not because I'm some important person, but because I belong to something and connected. There are people who come up and say, hey, I need your help, because I belong to a community. And that lack of connection to a human level community for so many people is what causes this alienation. And then this is just taken to 11 by lockdowns. I should say another thing. I think early on, I was blaming a lot of these negative effects, mental health, added alienation, on the government rules prohibiting us from getting together. But a huge part of it is the unwillingness of people on their own to get together. If you opened restaurants up to 100% in the DC and suburbs, they would still probably only be full about 25, 50%. So the isolation, a lot of it is self-inflicted.
That's very powerful. We have 2 questions from the audience. I don't know if either of you feel strongly towards either of them. If not, I can just read one.
Well, I'll address the cancel culture. How has the pandemic perpetuated cancel culture? I think I was referring to that with the New York Times story, but again, the fundamentalism, the idea that some ideas, we've always believed that some ideas are beyond the pale, right? Like if I started talking here and started defending slavery, they would kick me off the call, right? But the idea that the narrowing of and the leftward shift of the bounds of permissible opinion, I think is driven along by the pandemic, in part because, as I said, you're not bumping into somebody who, again, for a lot of people, like the only pro-life conservative Catholic they know. Or for some of my pro-life conservative Catholics, I'm the closest thing to a sort of never Trumper they know. And they can say, okay, not all those people are bad. Well, you're less likely to bump into somebody and learn their heterodox opinions if you're not seeing them. And so it's easier to imagine that only bad people have that opinion.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's turned it up to 11 on all this stuff that we were seeing before. Accelerated the trends, kind of exacerbated all the problems.
Well, and it centralizes our attention too. That's what I was referring to with the community stuff, that now one of the words used in cancel culture is accountability. Well, we're going to hold you accountable for what you said. Now, again, if the Federalist Society wants to hold me accountable for what I say on this call, they have every right because it's their call. Or my wife has a right to hold me accountable for anything I do. My employers for anything I do that's publicly facing. But not, or my congressman, I'm going to hold him to account for everything he does in public. I don't owe an account to everybody for everything I do. For what I did this morning, I don't need to be accountable to the Twitter mobs. I don't need to be accountable to Thomas or the Federalist Society for what I'm doing outside of this call. But the centralization of our attention and the not just the lockdowns, but Twitter and everything makes it seem like you have as much of a claim on my bad opinions as you do on your next door neighbor's, actions on the sidewalk or your congressman's opinions or anything like that. So the centralization of attention from modern technology, I think that gets exacerbated by the fact that we don't have real neighborly interactions as much. So we're much more likely to focus that attention on the Twitter machine or CNN or something. And so we think we have more of a claim on other people and thus we have a right to hold them accountable, even though they might not owe us an account.
And with that idea of accountability in mind, this is more of a less on the accountability individual, more on the state. What legal questions of rights and control of citizens' daily behaviors, approaches to lockdowns, whether it's state, federal, or local, has the pandemic brought into question?
I mean, it's sort of unreal that somebody could say, you can't get together with your in-laws for Christmas and Thanksgiving. I mean, a year ago, that would have been totally unthinkable. And the fact that there wasn't a lot of enforcement of police showing up to break up a quinceañera or a Christmas or a Thanksgiving that had more than 10 people, kind of pushed it to the back burner. But what else are they going to do this for? Are they going to do it on a bad flu season? Are they going to do it if they are afraid that we're spreading disinformation at these things? Like those powers, the federal government doesn't have these powers. State and local governments have broad powers when it's a contagious disease. I mean, our health officer in our county tried to shut down our non-public schools. And if it wasn't, he tried to close down our Catholic schools. Just absolutely amazing that he didn't say, I will close you down if you have an outbreak, or I'll close you down if you violate these rules. He just said, you can't meet in person. And thankfully our governor, Larry Hogan, a good governor, came in and pushed back and blocked that. But if Hogan had been on board, that would have been incredible. And then the Supreme Court recently had a ruling that disturbingly was not unanimous, saying that you can't discriminate against churches when it comes to public gatherings. And you had at least, was it Kagan and two others say, actually, no, if you have science on your side, you can. That seemed to be her argument. So that dissent in that California court ruling is one I've only gotten a glance at, but I'd want to read and see exactly where this effort to limit the free exercise of religion is going. If they think, well, if it's science-based, you can crack down on it. Well, that's the science of exception to the First Amendment is not something I had thought about before this year.
Yeah, that's right. So we saw intrusions into what you might call the self-governing of the filial group, right? The families deciding to get together, and then instructions from government officials to not do so. And we saw some governments wanting people to tattle on their neighbors if they were having too many people. And there were, I think it was in Oregon, where there were people driving around to see if there were too many cars outside people's houses. You could guess there were more than 6. So a couple things there. Intrusion into the internal governance of families, deciding, what their risk tolerance is and what they, whether or not it's worth seeing grandpa and grandma again this year, or, making those decisions for themselves, but also turning citizens against each other. So like our closest connection is not us in civil society interacting with each other and working things out. It's each of us individually to the state, and we'll report to the state on what our neighbor's doing. And this was already a problem. All the stories of, little Jimmy, was not where he was supposed to be. He was a few blocks over, and instead of calling Jimmy's dad, they called the police. That was already a thing that happened, ridiculously, and then you see it really exacerbated here. So intrusion into the filial family, I'm going to say intrusion into the local community, where you're trying to get our neighbors against each other. Let's make sure no one breaks these rules, and we'll rat you out to the mayor or the governor if you do. And then the intrusion to get into the First Amendment religious organizations, which has been for centuries in this country, that's been sacrosanct. So our right of assembly, for example, has been really important because of William Penn, who was famously arrested in 1670 for assembling. That was what he did. He had an unlawful assembly, and he was arrested for it. And that's basically the reason we have the Assembly Clause, is a reference in the debates over that. There's a reference to William Penn that showed up, because they almost struck that clause out. And somebody made a reference to William Penn, and that just took the day. Everyone was on William Penn's side. But we saw directly intrusions into the right of assembly and the right of religious assemblies. No, you cannot get together. No, you cannot meet in your school. And a pandemic, this is serious. It's not to downgrade that, but to point out that is a serious intrusion. One thing I thought about quite a bit, and I thought about writing an article on it, is there was when Alexander Hamilton created the Coast Guard to start taxing. The government was brand new, they needed the tax. He gave them instructions that when they interacted with citizens, he said, you are to remember that these are free citizens of a free republic. You are to not show haughtiness, you are not show entitlement, you are to be completely respectful and you collect taxes from them. So there was, this was 11 years after the revolution came to an end. You were not to pick a fight. That's how you interact. And there was almost no sense of that. No sense that I am intruding upon centuries of freedoms that Americans have had. Our right of religious free exercise, our right of assembly, and I am aware that this is completely inappropriate, but please bear with me. We're in the middle of a pandemic and I'm asking you to work with me. There was none of that. It was just this, these orders of, wow, it's the pandemic and I'm the governor and I have emergency powers. And it was disturbing, the lack of almost self-awareness. We're in the American Republic, and here we take these things, or we have taken these things for centuries, very, very seriously. And there was just no sense of that. It was very much a lost sense. And I think a lot could have been gained by just acting like Alexander Hamilton. And just when we approach you and we ask something of our citizens, you do it in a respectful way. We're asking you to withhold yourself from your religious assemblies. It's going to be short term, as short as we can. We realize we are impinging on your religious liberty, and just please bear with us. I think that would have gone a long way.
Do you think that mindset in the government will continue even after the pandemic has ended?
Yeah, that's my biggest concern, is exactly that. We've had 11 months of it, and I don't see it receding. Why would it? And kind of coupled with that was another disturbing trend of some public officials admitting that they had misled the public on some matters. And then saying, I wanted, Dr. Fossey had said, I wanted more people to get vaccinated, which is, as far as I can tell, a very good thing if people get vaccinated. But he was okay lying about it and moving some goalposts, lying about the statistics. Why would we think that coming to religious liberty and freedom of association, they might think that, as Tim pointed out, there's misinformation being spread at some meeting or something, and they have some good reason they think of why they'll intrude, and they're going to start intruding. And we have no reason to believe that the reasons they give will be accurate. We have no reason to think that they won't keep intruding on those Tim's Catholic Church, because there's disproportionate number of Trump voters there, who probably showed up on January 6th, something like that. They'll have some good reason that might be sympathetic, but they've shown they won't be honest about it. And I think like the long-term effect of the public health officials not telling the truth is, if you know you're being lied to, but you know your doctor's willing to lie to you, are you going to believe them about anything they tell you? When they're telling you to get your normal vaccinations, are you going to believe them if you know they'll lie? Now, of course, my kids are vaccinated and everything, but it could down the road have some very serious consequences in terms of our trust in public officials and our trust in each other as fellow citizens.
I think that's right. And I think that's sort of the misunderstanding of what science is, the belief that science is this ontological certainty that can be obtained, as opposed to science is, a way we can know things better through doubting and questioning and experimentation and hypotheses. That sort of misunderstanding of science does not mix well with democratic government. And just medicine in general, I kind of think doctors always are tempted to mislead us a little, to simplify us, to guide us towards what they think is good for us, right? I have a very good friend who's a doctor, and he said, on a lot of these conditions, it's how you turn out is like 40% genes and like 40% luck and like 10% whether you take your meds and 10% like exercise and diet and all that other stuff. I can affect that one narrow band. So I exaggerate how much the exercise, taking your meds, and eating right is, because you can't affect the luck or the genes. But if I tell them, you can move from 95% chance of this being serious to, 5% chance of this being serious to 2% chance of this being serious by behaving this way. Well, that fully forthright thing is not going to get the optimum behavior. And I don't even fault the doctor for doing that, but that's clearly what they've been doing. But they're also bad at it, right? Even when you're vaccinated, you're going to have to wear a mask and you can't hug grandma. Guess what that's doing? That's driving down the acceptance of the vaccine. So they're bad at it. But the bigger problem is that withholding information, you don't get to do that when you're representatives, when you work for us. That's, like if you go to your boss and you hold back some information because you want them to make the right decision, you're being insubordinate. That's what our government officials are doing when they're holding this back. The noble lie is not really allowed in a democracy when it comes to these things that most intimately affect us.
All right, and with that, I'm going to move to another question. I believe if anything's popping out to you. I guess we were discussing science earlier. Oh, sorry, my connection's bad.
Yeah, how do we restore the trust in the institutions is one of the questions from earlier. You start by admitting that the lies about don't wear masks and these bad messages about you have to wear the masks even after you're vaccinated, you have to admit that they were mistakes. And I think along political lines, some of the, my county was still banning outdoor church services while it was celebrating and hosting outdoor Black Lives Matter rallies. Like, that was a mistake. My county executive should go ahead and say, and thankfully he started allowing church in June. And I think it was because he had allowed BLM protests that they have to say, look, that was a mistake. They have to start by admitting their mistakes and next adopt the greater humility. Stop pretending science is this ontological certainty and start saying, look, these are our best guesses. And so we're going to do more guidance and less crackdowns. But the politicization of it really made it seem, and in places like California and Montgomery County, Maryland, I don't think it's wrong to guess that there was a bias against, it was a way to crack down on things they didn't like, such as people going to church. And so that has to be admitted and apologized for. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think Biden actually has some humility and could do it. I don't think Gavin Newsom or Mark Elrich or Andrew Cuomo have an ounce of it. And I don't think they're going to do it. And in our media, just like celebrating Andrew Cuomo every day while going after Ron DeSantis just showed like the level of distrust that sowed. And so I just wrote a piece. I went on vacation to Jamaica and accidentally ended up doing some reporting, and was trying to understand the universal vaccine resistance I was encountering. And then I came back and I read an NPR story about Idaho and how, based on misinformation and anti-science beliefs, all these white Trump-supporting conservatives weren't going to get vaccinated. And then an NPR article about African Americans. And based on the flaws of our healthcare system and a sensitivity to the past, African Americans were resisting the vaccination. So the very same phenomenon, depending on whether it's good people or bad people, gets described in opposite ways. This is what builds up the massive mistrust. These are not things that I imagine getting fixed anytime soon. So I'm sorry, I looked at this question hoping I'd have some good answer of how to rebuild trust. Hopefully, maybe they just go longer before making as big of an error again.
Yeah, from what I understand of the academic literature on trust and democracy, it's once trust is gone, I mean, it works almost like it does in a relationship. If somebody betrays you, it's hard to rebuild the trust when you know they're not trustworthy. So kind of as far as I can tell, the advice from people who study democracy and trust is be trustworthy, don't lie, and then try to encourage people to trust again. And over time, maybe we'll rebuild trust. And I just don't see that anyone will admit that what they did was a massive mistake. I mean, you look how long it took, Gavin Newsom and others to admit that when they broke their own rules, they were wrong, that they shouldn't have done it. And it took them multiple tries before, and they had to get caught, right? And they lied about it. And they said, "Oh, I shouldn't have done that, but that's okay. It was outdoors, and actually it was indoors." I mean, they just kept lying until it was like, we had pictures of him, and then we could say like, "Oh, see, you did this," and he's like, "Okay, fine, I shouldn't have done it." But it's, that's like my 4-year-old, that's that's what I have to do when he lies. And these are our most distinguished politicians. And the only way trust is rebuilt is if they are trustworthy, and then we come to believe they're trustworthy because they are trustworthy over time and they prove themselves. I just don't see it happening anytime soon.
All right, move to another audience question, slightly related to the discussion on mask wearing. Do you think this pandemic and the response to it will change the way the government health departments tackle the flu? Can we expect to see more targeted measures for future flu seasons with flu vaccines like the COVID vaccine going to be mandatory to participate in certain activities or be exempt from mask wearing if that practice continues?
I do think we'll see temporary mask mandates. And aside from governments, again, when the flu seasons were bad, the Archbishop in Washington would say no shaking hands. There's a part in Mass where you pass the peace. Now, we haven't done this in a year, but they would say, we're going to not do this until Easter. Okay. So that a lot of this will be instituted by institutions. I'm at American Enterprise Institute. Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, is one of my colleagues. He helped write some of these rules. If he says look, if you still after this is done, if you have a fever, if you have flu symptoms, don't show up. I basically, until I was a boss and I realized my duty to other people, I would show up with a little bit of a cold because I just thought I would power through it. So I think people's choices are going to change, but institutions are going to create rules, whether they're churches or schools or employers. I would not be surprised to see governors or other countries impose mask mandates during particularly bad flu seasons. Maybe they'll be more limited. I would be surprised if in our lifetime, with an outbreak much less contagious than this, you still see public events getting banned for, I mean, and you've seen it before with Ebola and those sort of things. I think that now in the US, in the West, in places where the sort of the lockdowns were uncommon, a dam has sort of been broken, and you will see that. The flu vaccine has never approached the efficacy that it looks like the COVID vaccine has. So I don't think that'll be parallel. But on the other hand, from what I know, the healthcare workers I know, nurses, are required to get that every year to continue working in their hospitals. I don't know how universal that is, but you could see teachers required to get it or that sort of thing. But that would be not a change in kind from what we're doing now with the flu vaccine.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're going to be a lot more touchy about flu season than we have in the past. And some of it will be salutary. It'll be, perfectly kind of socially acceptable for me to teach a class from home when I'm a little under the weather. Whereas, just a year ago, it'd be weird to teach a class. If I told everyone I wanted to teach on Zoom for a week, it would have been weird. But now it wouldn't be at all. And it might even be expected, which would probably be good. And, a couple of students typing in through Zoom instead of coughing in front of my classroom, I'm probably going to be okay with that. But I do think we're going to be a lot touchier with canceling events. And I'm a little worried about, this kind of relates to the previous question, intrusions into religious worship and that sort of thing. We get a bad flu season and we get a kind of a 3-month moratorium on meetings, over 50 people or whatever. And suddenly, churches are in the same position, every year, every February, we get into the same position they are right now. I'm worried about something like that. We're going to be a lot touchier about it. And there'll be salutary results of that, but we could see the kind of long run problems with freedom of assembly and freedom of religion.
Yeah, with those predictions in mind, do you think those are positive aspects, those are negative aspects? What do you look forward to? What do you fear with that?
Well, I look forward to hopefully getting sick, every February, a little less often in the future, because and being able to, it is kind of nice to stay home when you're sick, and I'll be able to do it. So get my classes taught. I'm looking forward to that. But I think we'll have disruptions in our social lives. It'll be hard to reset our social lives when they're going to meet some major disruptions on we get a 3-month moratorium on meetings every year. That's going to be hard to be in the habit of going to church when you keep getting that interruption. And I'm a little worried that it'll be hard to ever get back, most of us to get back to a healthy social life with, involved in our organizations and our weekly meetings and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm going to try to come up with something positive to say here, I think a lot of us realize how much we miss seeing people and will be more deliberate about it. I may actually pull off my neighborhood block party, which in past years I've never been able to, but come May, if the numbers are down to 1% positivity and all my elderly neighbors are vaccinated, it'll be sort of extra cause to celebrate. What I've always thought about social media and a lot of this technology is that it aids us getting together in person is when it's doing its best. So that is a Zoom call could be when we're going to have an in-person panel, we do a Zoom call beforehand. Everybody knows their face like a day ahead of time. So social media, et cetera, serving us getting together in person could be a positive. Us realizing, wait a second, even though I can work remotely all the time, there really was a benefit. I really did suffer from this would be another positive development. And to get a little bit political, a positive development is that it's inescapable that the teachers unions are averse to your children's best interests. And so I would hope that this would cause school boards to stand up to their teachers unions and teachers to stand up to their teachers unions, and certainly parents to stand up to their teachers unions more often. And I would hope that more private schools and charter schools spring up from this experience, realizing that flexibility and small size is incredibly valuable, and that massive public school factories are not the right environment for learning.
Yeah, I do know some people who started basically small private schools, and one couple in particular did it right before the pandemic, just on their own. They thought that was a good idea for their kids, and kind of a few other couples, and it was perfect timing for them, providential, really. But I think that might be a silver lining, is people going. We all, Tim probably already knew that was a pretty good idea before all this. But it really highlighted just how good of an idea it was. And it really makes, you can think of it from kind of a Nassim Taleb perspective. You have all those little schools all over the place. That's pretty anti-fragile. It's hard to destroy education when it's taking place in groups of 5 to 10 families all over the country, rather than these massive schools, which are kind of easy to take down and you're dependent on them, right? This is what we're really, real tragedy is. All those kids who are dependent upon the public school system, and they can't meet in these massive schools, and they don't come from a background that's really going to be able to support them in that way. But we become dependent upon them. But if we're dependent upon the small families, there's a lot of those, and it might make us more anti-fragile from the Nassim Taleb perspective.
And that reminds me of another point. I know lots of families who sort of formed bubbles or pods or whatever, said if we're not going to be allowed to interact with everybody, let's just form a group that we will interact freely with, and we'll impose on each other the accountability to not go out and go drinking in a bar or go to big concerts or whatever, licking doorknobs or any dangerous behavior. And that understanding, is so clear to people who were trying to work from home while help run the homeschooling, that they needed parental support. As a wise woman once put it, it takes a village to raise a child. If more families realize that in all regards, you know what, we need to be very close and get help raising our kids, not from just the public school, the daycare we're providing in us, but from these organic networks of communities and other adults and other kids, that if that is a renewed realization, that would be very good for families and communities.
All right. Just to clear out that last final question in our Q&A box, as technology obviously makes working from home easier, whether it's your professor and finance, how will global commerce be affected in the long run, and will this spur outsourcing?
I mean, this revealed two things, right? Like, one was the fragility of supply lines, and like people became more self-sufficient. Like, did any of you get people do the sourdough thing? Chickens isn't, so a lot of people started making their own bread, right? A lot of people started raising their own chickens. A lot of town councils had to say, hey, we already outlawed chickens. We're going to double outlaw chickens, because people wanted their own eggs and didn't want to have to depend on national supply lines. And then global supply lines of things like Lysol wipes and that kind of thing. My wife looked up, home remedies that involve things that weren't disrupted. So to some extent, it made us a little more worried about fragility. I think in that regard, the rapidity with which supply lines rebounded and shortages were addressed showed sort of the magic of the modern economy. But certainly there are all sorts of services that you think could be further outsourced and offshored. But we've already done so much of that I don't think it's not too many people have their call centers, in New York City or Washington, D.C. anyway. So I don't know that but maybe I'm just not being imaginative enough here. I'm hoping that they don't, I guess we're the ones, right? Luke and I, like the knowledge workers that still are supposed to be here. Maybe all the opinion journalists and college professors are the ones who are going to be offshored.
Yeah, I think we kind of have that. I agree with Tim. I think we've done a lot of it already, and we did. In some ways, maybe it was kind of helpful. It helped us know what the shortages would be in an emergency. And the supply line snapped back pretty quick, but all of us, who lived through this thing can kind of think like, I'm going to keep that big package of toilet paper in the attic, just in case.
All right, and I think with no more, if there's any more audience questions, please send them in now. If not, is there anything more you'd like to add before we finish up?
I'll just add a imploration. If you think about what you've lost over the last year and what you're looking at getting back, and why a time like college and law school can really be so rewarding. It's the constant proximity and I mean physical proximity to other people engaged in the same sort of difficult undertaking that you are. That where you find meaning in life is going to involve being around other people and immersing yourself into little platoons, whether it's your law school class, your Federalist Society, your softball team, even your corner pub can count as one of these. And that if you're going to make a difference in the world, it's much more likely to be through one of these little platoons than by being, the next David Boies or anything like that. Your law schools all over the world have buildings named after really successful people who made a lot of money and donated. And if you do become really successful and have lots of money, build institutions of civil society. But I always talk about the T-ball field at my parish. It's called DeTolli's Diamond. Mike DeTolli was not some big donor to St. Andrews. He was a dad who coached youth baseball for years and years. And so you might not get to be, either Antonin Scalia, who gets a law school named after him, or a big donor, but you can be Mike DeTolli as long as you immerse yourself in these communities wherever you end up.
Yeah, this has given us an opportunity. I mean, one thing is I talked about the habituation towards being alone and technology, but it also gave us a chance we'd already been sliding in that direction, spending less time in face-to-face. And this did give us a chance. I call it we've been hearing about the Great Reset. It gives us a chance for a great social reset. So all of us can just reset our social lives. When this is over, Friday and Saturday nights, I'm going out to dinner with friends, I've decided. That's what we're going to do as a family. But, we'd already not been doing it a lot before, frankly. You're busy. I've got little kids. It gets busy. And this is kind of a chance to reset. And that's what I hope we kind of get out of this. That'll be the real pushback is people saying, all right, I've been watching too much Netflix. Now I'm watching way too much. But I have a chance now to really go get involved in that softball club that I told myself I would do it. And now that I've been alone for 11 months, I'm definitely doing it now. And we have that chance at a kind of a social reset.
All right, and just to remind us that we're in FedSoc, we have one more question. Do you think the pandemic causes/increases the politicization of the judicial system or judicial activism?
I would think judges would be susceptible to the same pressure, the same forces that the rest of us are. That if they're not sitting on a bench with their colleagues and eating lunch and playing basketball with their colleagues in the same dining room, they're much more likely to drive towards intolerance, fundamentalism, and that sort of thing. I will say, so I do think you'll get less consensus, more extremism, that sort of thing. On the other hand, I'm thinking back about the rulings on a lot of this. Again, in California, we won at the Supreme Court with at least one, I think two Democrats. And I don't think we got a lot of crazy court rulings about this. But I would suspect that judges who aren't together are less likely to be able to find common ground. Not that judges who hang out together can't be totally different. I mean, Ginsburg and Scalia, obviously, but they're less likely to even see the validity in the other side's argument if they're not playing basketball, and having lunch together.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think their psychological states are going to be just as fragile as ours. And that's going to affect their reasoning and that sort of thing in a way that won't be good. I always show my students a debate when we talk about judicial interpretation between Breyer and Scalia, and you can see as they disagree, like whenever the other one's talking, the silent one has a wry smile on their face. You can tell they've been working together for 15 years. They're friends. They have coffee every day. And so, yeah, they disagree, but it can be this like back and forth and like they're teasing and there's been none of that for 11 months between our justices and judges. And that has to have ramifications.
All right. Thank you so much for coming, to both our panelist speakers and for the audience. I think that pretty much wraps it up. Have a great night.
Thank you.